Good evening, everybody. Today I'll be talking about stench of kerosene. I'll be working on this paper, and first of all, stench of kerosene, the work that I'll be dealing with is a translation and by Kushwant Singh, and it was originally written by a Punjabi writer, Amrita Preetham. And my paper challenges the conventional reading of gender in Amrita Preetham's short story titled Stench of Kerosene. 2 years ago, my reading of this text was heavily inclined towards looking only at the suffering inflicted upon Guleri by her in-laws. In the very process of reading, Manak's characterization just fades into the background, while Guleri's horrific death tends to easily overwhelm the reader's sensibilities. Now reading the story in tandem with Bell Hook's Understanding Patriarchy, a new perspective can be provided for this text. In the first section of my paper, the key points from Bell Hook's essay are discussed in great detail, and in the following session, the main points from the essay, from Bell Hook's essay, will be used to substantiate the understanding of patriarchy in Stench of Kerosene. So firstly, I'll be discussing the main points that come under Bell Hook's essay titled Understanding Patriarchy. Firstly, I'll be discussing about how does she talk about patriarchy. So the term that she uses is imperialist, white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and this term actually tells us about the ways in which there is a way in which patriarchy works. It's not just, it's an interlocked political systems which operate within society, and one such political system is patriarchy. And this patriarchy is again enmeshed within other power structures which exist within different societies. So firstly, she provides a definition of patriarchy. So Bell Hooks calls it a political social system that insists that male are inherently dominating, superior to everything, and everyone deemed weak, especially females, endowed with right to dominate and rule over the weak, and to maintain that dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence. The definition of patriarchy provided by Bell Hooks is interesting in the sense that she refers to patriarchy as a system, and in other words, this definition of patriarchy moves beyond individual actions of men and women. Also, she points out, Bell Hooks points out to the ways in which patriarchal thinking is taught. For instance, she emphasizes on the role of institutions such as schools, courthouses, clubs, sports arenas, as well as churches, and she also talks about how home is a central space through which gender roles are taught by parents and learned by children. Moreover, you see that the ways in which patriarchal thinking is taught in society and at homes, and it becomes so much entrenched within the psyches that at a point you feel that it's a natural way to organize life altogether. And also she talks about ways in which this patriarchal culture is maintained constantly. So one of the ways in which this culture is maintained is through blind obedience. So blind obedience is basically where you repress every other emotions other than fear, and you constantly destroy individual will, and you submit to the voice of the authority. So this is the way in which the system actually perpetrates. And also she talks about Bell Hooks talks about the ways in which patriarchy affects men and women. And also it is important to note that she moves away from the conventional rhetoric of blaming men for women's oppression. And also she talks about the negative impact of sexism on male identity. So she gives emphasis to the point of male pain in her essay. And also she talks about how this system is very, very harmful to the male in the sense that it disables them to experience all sort of emotions. So they become emotionally crippled, and it sort of they confine themselves to the system, and they tend to perform gender roles without much thinking. It's almost like this entity that they submit themselves to. They don't have any expression or freedom to move away from the overarching system which actually supports the entire society. And also she talks about the fact that also it's very important to note that Bell Hooks does say that men also are being affected by patriarchal system. At the same time, she doesn't tell that just because the overarching system is responsible for men's actions, it doesn't mean that we can excuse men for oppressing women. In other words, men are still responsible for perpetuating and exploiting women within the patriarchal system, and she recognizes and acknowledges the reality of both in the sense that on one sense patriarchy as a system which oppresses men and women, on the second hand she also acknowledges that men do oppress women. So she gives emphasis to both these realities, and that's how she talks about patriarchy in her whole essay. And firstly, I'll be talking about this reading of Stench of Kerosene from the perspective of conventionally looking at it, like looking at the way in which we understand Guleri and Manak's actions. So, if you look at the conventional mode of blaming men for oppression and exploitation of Guleri, you can see that firstly Guleri is someone who is easily she easily fits into the mold of an ideal daughter-in-law. So you can see that she's like totally into doing her day-to-day chores. She actually performs all the functions in her in-laws home without any complaint, and you can also see that she's like perfectly fine there, like as of now. And you can see that once the point where she's unable to conceive, that's when her life changes forever. She's abandoned, actually she's abandoned, so taking advantage of like Guleri's absence, we can see that Manak gets married to a new woman, and the swift manner in which Guleri is replaced in her in-laws home is truly appalling. And also you can see that Manak is easily able to move on from Guleri. I mean, it does sound very brutal and emotionless of Manak to like abandon Guleri and move away from her life. And also you can see that there are certain privileges that Manak does enjoy. He is able to easily proceed with his life, whereas that is not the case with Guleri. She is abandoned to her own fate, and we can see that she dies a tragic death after she knows that her husband gets married to a new woman. And this is one reading of it. So this reading actually like talks about looking at Guleri and how she is submitted to this like terrible fate because she's not able to conceive a child. And you can also like quickly on the first reading you can look and tell that Manak's actions are quite brutal and emotionless, and he's not able to understand Guleri. You can call his actions very ruthless at the face value. And this is my second reading. So second reading, I am reading the text again in relation to Bell Hook's essay Understanding Patriarchy. So you can see that the objective of my paper was to challenge the first reading. But at the same time, when I'm challenging my first reading of looking at Guleri and Manak, I'm not actually kind of like negating it totally. So my second reading actually can exist in parallel with my first reading. I'll show you how. And so firstly, I'll be using Bell Hook's essay Understanding Patriarchy. So firstly, in my first reading, what I've done is I have looked at Guleri and Manak as individuals, as their actions as being private and separate. I'm talking about Guleri and her exploitation. I'm talking about Manak and how he is ruthless. But again, we can see that we can take Bell Hook's essay, our definition of patriarchy as a political social system, to understand like the nuanced ways in which we can understand Guleri's oppression and Manak's actions. So what I mean to say by this is that through Bell Hook's essay, we can actually look at the ways in which Guleri is oppressed, and the rationale for Manak's actions can acquire a different dimension. And so firstly, I would like to tell that there is no doubt that Guleri is completely exploited and betrayed by her in-laws because she is unable to conceive, and she dies a tragic death. She burns herself. And however, we can see that there are seemingly other modes of understanding Guleri's existence and Manak's behavior, which is the fact is that we need to know that her exploitation doesn't start at the point where she is betrayed by her in-laws, in the sense that her oppression starts at a point where she enters the text. So if you start reading the text from the introduction, you can see the ways in which Guleri is systematically structured within the entire society. You can see that so it's evident from the starting of the text that her hometown, Guleri's hometown, Champa, is just a few miles away from her husband's place. However, she is not allowed to move outside her in-laws home. So you have various instances where you can see her pining to go to her place, but of course she doesn't complain. And also you can see that she is allowed to go only for a few days, and that too during the harvest festival, to her husband's place, to her native place. And also you can see that her way or lifestyle, the way in which the words used to totally structure Guleri's world are totally interesting, because you look at a lot of feminine images coming in to tell about the ways in which Guleri usually spends her time in her own home. So you have she is like totally going for dupattas and glass bangles and silver earrings, and there's a very rich world, and it's like completely sealed. You can see that she completely fits into it, and like it's almost like there is no a place of escape for her outside that sealed world. And you also have it that she regularly performs all the household chores, and like she's total nobody, there is no place where she's actually like oppressed or something. We don't see anything of that sort. But however, what I feel is that there is a way in which the entire text moves on, and we understand that she's completely sealed in that world. She's actually in the patriarchal system, and as I have already spoken before, the system is so entrenched that she actually feels all this might be very natural. So if you look at this, when Guleri at one point, when Manak and Guleri are meeting before their marriage, she says to Manak, "If you want me, go and ask for my hand from my father." So you see that there is a very clear-cut system in which the entire story is moving forward. You can see that she's placed very strongly within the patriarchal system, that she even doesn't know that there is something happening like this. And also you can see that even the entire the idea of marriage between Manak and Guleri is entirely placed within the economical system, about the issue of bride price that comes in when Manak gets worried about how he is going to pay to Guleri's father. So you can see that the entire vocabulary in which the entire system of marriage is placed itself is very much rooted in the idea of the systematic functioning of patriarchy. And at the same time, we should not limit ourselves by reading Manak's actions as being brutal and ignorant. As I tell you, the first reading in which I have done, you can clearly dismiss Manak by telling that he's not considering it, he's not brave enough, or he's not bold enough. But if you look at it, that is not the case, because it is out of Manak's consciousness. He cannot actually insist on Guleri staying back, despite the fact that Guleri is not able to conceive. He is not able to vocalize it because he is so entrenched within the system that he doesn't see it as an option himself. So you can also see that the way in which the thinking is entrenched within Manak is by his mother's words. She's like, be a man. And you can also see that at certain points we have this sentence where he blindly adheres to what he has to do. He has to marry, he has to get a child. You don't see him come out of the system, and he doesn't consciously, that option of asking Guleri to stay back is very ruled out for him. So this is a sentence from the text that I'll be reading. Obedient to his mother and to custom, Manak's body responded to the new woman, but his heart was dead within him. So there is no question of moving outside the system. Manak just can't consciously think about bringing Guleri back, and he has to obey to the entire system. So this actually shows us the way in which religion and marriage, etc., also overlap within the entire system of patriarchy, and they provide a definition to the way in which Manak exists within the society. And also you can see that Manak is totally emotionally repressed throughout the story. You don't see him articulate his his opinion in any manner, but at last towards the climax you can see that what he wants comes in the form of his unconscious ways in which he thinks about Guleri actually come out in the story. And towards my conclusion, I would like to point out that the second reading, in which I was talking about patriarchy as a system, does not negate the first one of looking at Guleri's oppression and Manak's actions as being ignorant and ruthless. And Manak's actions towards Guleri, her abandoning her, and moving on, you can't justify it by just saying that Manak's actions are located, they must be, situated within the larger structure of patriarchy, and you just can't brush apart Manak's actions by saying that, it's a larger system that is actually shaping Manak's identity. And the superior position of male in comparison to a female is always there within the story. So you can see that Manak is invested with the capacity to move on with his life, while Guleri is unable to conceive. So he is able to abandon Guleri and just plainly move on with his life, and in no way we see him being socially ostracized or alienated from the society because the couple couldn't conceive. We see that the entirely Guleri is the one who is actually kind of abandoned and who is unable to take it, and she kills herself in the end. And also it's important to know that when Guleri dies, we don't see any blame that is being put upon Manak, and unconsciously there are some privileges that Manak keeps on taking it from the system, and we can actually see that this is how it's located. So in the second reading, what I am trying to do is that we need to acknowledge two things. One is that patriarchy as a system functions and defines both male and female identity. We see that Guleri and Manak as two representatives who are functioning within the patriarchal system. On the other hand, you can't negate the fact that men oppress women. You can see that Guleri actually suffers a kind of a she dies, but Manak actually has some kind of privileges that the system gives him. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.